After the catastrophic reign of Empress Xianfeng, the Qing dynasty ruling the Chinese Empire was on the verge of collapse. The nation was plagued by widespread unrest and rebellions, and had lost territory and influence to several Western nations in the Second Opium War. As Xianfeng died in 1861, the throne passed on to his 5-year-old son, Zaichun, who would become Emperor Tongzhi. His short reign, mostly controlled by his mother and stepmother's regency, would see a restoration of the Qing dynasty. In 1856, as the Qing dynasty was completely losing control on the military, political and economic stage, weak Emperor Xianfeng, aged 24, became father of a boy named Zaichun. The young imperial child was born of concubine Yi, 5th-rank consort to the emperor. To thank her for his first son, the emperor decided to promote her to consort Yi of the 4th rank. Zaichun was born in the Old Summer Palace, a huge palace complex next to the capital Beijing, to which the emperors regularly withdrew. It had been built during the High Qing era, golden age of the dynasty. After this period had come to an end with Emperor Qianlong's late reign, the Qing dynasty had slowly crumbled, losing influence to Western powers and control over its population. At the time of Zaichun's birth, the nation's treasury was practically empty, and the dynasty faced many peasant uprisings in the south of the country, the Taiping, Nian, Red Turban and Miao rebellions. In addition, the Pantai rebellion was about to break out as well, and the Qing dynasty would also find itself at war with the French and British empires. In 1858, as the Second Opium War raged on, Emperor Xianfeng had a second son, who however died immediately after his birth. Zaichun therefore remained the only son of the emperor. By autumn 1860, as the Qing dynasty was being decisively defeated by the Franco-British forces, whose soldiers were arriving at the gates of Beijing, Emperor Xianfeng decided to flee the capital. Escaping the conflict, the imperial family, including Zaichun and his mother, noble consort Yi of the 3rd rank, took flight to Chengde, a city in the imperial domain over 200 kilometers northeast of Beijing.
成儿，在皇上身边，言行要谨慎，一切听懿贵妃娘娘的话。
知道了。
Before leaving Beijing, Emperor Xianfeng entrusted his half-brother, Yixin, Prince Gong, to deal with the British and the French. In the middle of this chaos, far from understanding the political turmoil the nation was in, young Prince Zaichun accompanied his parents to Chengde, to the city's mountain resort, previous imperial hunting lodge. A few weeks later, the Qing dynasty, having lost the Second Opium War, signed the Convention of Peking. Large portions of the empire were lost to Russia, new treaty ports were opened for trade, and Christianity was legalized. Devastated, Emperor Xianfeng refused to return to Beijing. The imperial family therefore remained in Chengde. There, Imperial Prince Zaichun would spend the next few months growing up. By 1861, it was time for him to start his education. Imperial authorities ordered a prominent scholar, Li Hongzhao, to tutor the child. At the same time, Emperor Xianfeng, having lost all hope, gave up on state affairs, switching to a lifestyle of overindulgence which destroyed his health. Soon later, he fell deeply ill and showed no signs of recovery. His death would however lead to a big problem. As Zaichun was only 5 years old, he could not take up the reins of the empire on his own. The dying emperor therefore arranged for 8 regents, led by Manchu nobleman Suishun, to take control of the Qing dynasty until Zaichun reached majority. On the 22nd of August 1861, Xianfeng died. Upon the emperor's passing, his 2 main wives, the childless empress and noble consort Yi, Zaichun's mother, were promoted as Empress Dowager Ci'an and Empress Dowager Cexi. Cexi had no faith in the 8 regents the late emperor had appointed, especially in Su Xun, their leader, and his 2 brothers, Zai Yuan and Dunhua. Moreover, she wished to secure political power for herself. As tensions grew between the 8 regents and her, she grew close to Ci'an, as well as to the Prince Gong, Yixin, and to the Prince Chun, Yixuan, both being brothers of the late emperor. As the imperial funeral procession for Xianfeng left Chengde for Beijing, Cexi and little Prince Zaichun went ahead of the ceremony and returned to Beijing with haste. Plotting against the 8 regents, Cexi and her allies then fabricated charges against them successfully bringing them down from power. Alongside with Ci'an, the two Empresses Dowager became the new official regents for Zaichun. On the 11th of November, the boy was crowned as Emperor Tongzhi, first child emperor of the dynasty since glorious Kangxi. The two empresses' regents, backed by Princes Gong and Chun, aimed to restore the Qing dynasty, which was on the verge of collapse. Internal rebellions were still rampant, and the nation was in an extremely weak position vis-à-vis the Western powers. One of their first measures as regents was to arrange child Emperor Tongzhi's education. Great scholars were appointed as his tutors: Li Hongzao, who had previously already taught Tongzhi when he was a prince in Chengde, Qi Junzao, a politician and poet, and Wang Xinzun, who had been the teacher of late Emperor Xianfeng and his brother Yixin, the Prince Gong. Hopes that the new emperor would grow up to be an enlightened leader like Emperor Kangxi soon faded, as Tongzhi showed little to no interest in his studies. Li Hongzao was the only teacher he would occasionally listen to. In parallel, many scholars who advocated nationwide reforms since the disastrous defeat in the First Opium War began to be heard. China was about to undergo the self-strengthening movement. During the first part of this period, the Empresses Dowager successfully reformed China in what would be called the Tongzhi Restoration. I will however detail these events in my Empress Dowager Cixi video. Rapidly, a change of diplomatic stance with the Western powers greatly improved international relations, as the Zhongli Yamen, or Board of Ministers for Foreign Affairs, was created by Yixin, Prince Gong, to deal with diplomacy with the Westerners. Meanwhile, the child emperor's tutors tried their best to give him a profound classical education. Tongzhi, however, grew up to be unsubordinate and stubborn. Close advisors lost faith in his ability to one day bring China to a powerful position. Through the efforts of the main figures behind the self-strengthening movement, including statesman Zhang Guofan, who controlled the Xiang army, a modernized force, the many rebellions in the nation were gradually crushed. Improved relations with the Western powers also led them to assist and guide the Qing forces in suppressing the Taiping Rebellion. Zhang Guofan's apprentice, Li Hongzhang, who had distinguished himself in the conflict, founded the Jiangnan Arsenal in Shanghai in 1865. This establishment rapidly became the largest modern arms factory in all of East Asia. The compound also held a language school, and Western advisors were employed in senior positions. By 1872, Emperor Tongzhi reached the age of 16. The young monarch still showed no interest in his studies, nor in state affairs. The two regents judged the time had come to organize a marriage for the emperor. Empress Dowager Ci'an, his stepmother, advised him into choosing as Empress Lady Aruta, a Manchu aristocrat of the bordered yellow banner. This 18-year-old girl was actually the granddaughter of Donghua, one of the 8 regents late Emperor Xianfeng had appointed at first for Tongzhi. Because of this, tensions immediately rose between her and Empress Dowager Cixi. As both regents, Ci'an and Cixi, disagreed, they decided to let the emperor choose for himself. Seduced by Lady Aruta and perhaps to defy Cixi, Tongzhi did choose her as his wife, and she was elevated as Empress Xiao Zheyi. The new Empress Xiao Zheyi would however be hated by her mother-in-law, Empress Dowager Cixi, for all her life. In addition to his main wife, teenage Emperor Tongzhi chose 2 additional concubines, and would soon take 2 more. Now married, Emperor Tongzhi's ambition was boosted. He now wanted to reclaim imperial power and rid himself of his mother and stepmother's regency. Cixi was however not ready to step down from power yet, and refused to restore power to Tongzhi in 1872. She further judged that Empress Xiao Zheyi acted arrogantly towards her, and ended up forcing Tongzhi to stop seeing his wife, who he seemed to genuinely love. Consequently, Tongzhi found himself isolated in the Palace of Heavenly Purity, which increased his frustration. During the next few weeks, he grew chaotic and even more stubborn, often beating servants and showing cruelty. It is reported that alongside his cousin Zaichun, son of his uncle Yixin, Prince Gong, the 2 teenagers regularly slipped out of the imperial city during the night and visited brothels in Beijing. According to this theory, the emperor contracted sexually transmitted disease from this debauchery, possibly syphilis. By early 1873, Emperor Tongzhi had legally come of age. This date had been fixed upon the establishment of the regency. This time, there was nothing Cixi could do to retain authority. The Empress Dowager had no choice but to step down from power, as the nearly 17-year-old became supreme leader of the Qing dynasty. Nonetheless, it was clear that Tongzhi and ci'an still held unofficial powerful positions and strongly influenced court politics. By this period, the diplomatic system between China and the West had been completely rearranged. Foreign envoys were no longer required to kowtow before the emperor, and could hold talks with him directly, which symbolically marked the end of the Qing dynasty's international authority. The foreign powers were eager to hold talks with the young Emperor Tongzhi, a practice unthinkable only a few decades prior. Just a few weeks after the emperor had taken up the reins of the dynasty, the French, British, Russians, Americans, Dutch, and the emerging Japanese, who would soon become more powerful than the Qing dynasty, sent diplomats for an audience with the 16-year-old leader. The Japanese envoy was received first and separately, and requested compensation for the murder of 54 shipwrecked Ryukyun sailors by Taiwanese aboriginals back in 1871. The demand was made as the island of Taiwan was nominally Qing territory, therefore under its responsibility. The emperor, however, denied him the request. In retaliation, the recently modernized army and navy of the Empire of Japan led a punitive expedition to Taiwan and occupied the island. The Qing would later have no choice but to pay 500,000 taels of silver for the Japanese to withdraw from Taiwan. Following the fashion of his undisciplined childhood, Tongzhi disliked the daily tasks of a Qing emperor. Although he was pushed to continue his classical education, he avoided this duty as much as he could. Nonetheless, Tongzhi would have one major project in his short life. Supported by several conservative officials, he wished to restore the old summer palace, his birthplace, that had been sacked and burnt down by the Franco-British forces during the Second Opium War.
我要重修圆明园，让两位太后颐养天年。
The emperor claimed he wished to restore the palace as a resting place for his mother, Empress Dowager Cixi, and stepmother, Empress Dowager Ci'an, exhausted by the labor of many years. In reality, this was probably an attempt to keep them away from the imperial court. The restoration project would however require huge investment, and the meagre treasury that had barely been organized during the regency was being spent on repressing the many rebellions. Therefore, a large number of officials protested against the idea. Nonetheless, Tongzhi had enough authority to force the project, and plans and models were made by imperial architects. The emperor's stubbornness to the restoration of the old summer palace led him to a clash with several ministers, including his uncles Yixin, Prince Gong, and Yixin, Prince Chun. Alongside other ministers, Yixin submitted a memorial criticizing the teenage emperor's behavior, which was not well received. The infuriated Tongzhi immediately ordered Yixin to be dismissed and demoted. However, both Empresses Dowager, still extremely influent, knew that Yixin was an essential pillar to the dynasty. He was also the most experienced Qing officials in terms of diplomacy and exchange with the Westerners. The very next day, the Empresses Dowager organized a restoration of Yixin to his previous positions, increasing Tongzhi's frustration towards his mother and stepmother. Ignoring rampant criticism, Tongzhi went on with his plans to rebuild the old summer palace, regularly moving out of the Forbidden City to inspect the progress of the works. During these occasions, he took the opportunity to escape his imperial duties and indulge in comforts outside the Forbidden City. Eventually, after many buildings had been restored and debris cleaned up, Tongzhi conceded to halt the restoration of the old summer palace around September 1874, which had already cost the treasury large sums of money. In November 1874, as he was 18 years old, Tongzhi fell deeply ill, most likely of smallpox, but possibly of sexually transmitted disease contracted in brothels. Significantly weakened, he ordered his tutor, Li Hongzao, to write edicts for him. The Empresses Dowager, however, soon used the pretext of the emperor's health to reclaim power, resuming the regency. By the 12th of January 1875, Emperor Tongzhi died at 18 years old. Heartbroken and left unprotected against her rival mother-in-law, his wife Empress Xiao Zheyi lost hope. Her health rapidly deteriorated, and she died a few weeks after her husband. There were rumors that she was pregnant at the time. If so, the birth of a son who would have become the next emperor would have made her Empress Dowager. According to these rumors, Cixi was involved with her death to avoid this scenario, although this cannot be proven. In any case, Tongzhi died childless. For the first time, the direct bloodline of the Qing leaders since the dynasty's precursor, Jurchen chieftain Nurhaci, came to a halt. Emperor Tongzhi had neither brother nor children. a succession crisis subsequently took place, as different factions argued on what to do next. Empress Dowager Cixi, unwilling to step down from power, organized the selection of an heir that would allow her to keep acting as regent. The carefully chosen successor was 3-year-old Zaitian, son of Yixin, Prince Chun, and of Cixi's own sister. Zaitian was therefore a grandson of Emperor Daoguang and Cixi's own nephew. To legitimize his position as heir, the Empress Dowager declared Zaitian the adoptive son of late Emperor Xianfeng and herself. Emperor Tongzhi reigned for a little over 13 years, although exercising actual authority only the last 2 years. His reign saw a restoration of the Qing dynasty through radical reforms of the regency and an opening up to the Western world and technology. Had these reforms not taken place, the nation would most likely have collapsed. Tongzhi, though, showed no signs of being a good ruler, being both weak and uninterested, and his premature death was possibly fortunate for the sake of the dynasty. With renewed power, Empresses Dowager Cixi and Ci'an, regents of the new child Emperor Zaitian, crowned Guangxu, would have to face increasing tensions between China, Western powers, and the newly modernized Empire of Japan. Thank you for watching my video, I hope you enjoyed it. If so, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions or requests, feel free to leave them in the comments section below.